introduce him that way.
And lots of grace for Adam, guys. This is his third public appearance today. He's been going since 7 a.m. He's been going since 7 a.m. Kev's been going since late last night with our FaithTech Toronto event. So hands up for these guys just for being here and helping us out. So Adam, thanks for having us. Kev, why don't you say a couple words, man? I know you and Adam worked together for quite a while at FaithTech, and why don't you just introduce what he's been up to lately?
Yeah, so guys, if you want to connect with someone who thinks deeply about technology, about the theology that surrounds it, but who has the gift of putting that into words that normal human beings like you and I can understand, Adam is your guy. He is just awesome. And on a personal level, I've just really enjoyed the opportunities Adam and I have had to work together, running sprints together, creating tools and material together to make that happen. And that's been real fun. And I'm really looking forward to what we're going to talk about tonight, this whole thing of AI and LaMDA and sentience. I think I understand about 20% of that concoction of words already. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the rest of it is all about. So I'll jump off the stage now and leave it for you, Isaac and Adam, to carry on. But yeah, it's great to have you with us, buddy.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Well, it's great to be with you all. I wish I had an AI that could just multiply me, and then you would get hopefully a better version of me. But I am rallying, and I'm here tonight, and I've been really excited to talk about AI, talk about consciousness, and and try and convince all of you that you're wrong when you say no, it's not sentient.
Here we go.
No, not necessarily, but I do hope to just be able to challenge our thinking and figure out, okay, does this even matter? Is this relevant to us? How should we be thinking about it?
Yeah, and guys, just so you understand the format here, I'm going to be asking Adam a few questions that I think are relevant to the community, kind of asking the questions that I think all of us are having when we read that headline of, is Google's LaMDA sentient? I had not a lot of an idea of what was possibly behind that headline until I started looking into it, but I'm going to be asking questions that revolve around that. And if anyone's got anything at any point, just drop it in the chat. Like, we might have a few minutes at the end to engage with your own questions if something's not answered in our time here. So I'm going to kick things off first, Adam, with just really briefly, what is Google LaMDA, if you can do it briefly? And maybe just explain the problem that it's actually set out to solve or is perceived to solve.
Yeah. So LaMDA is an acronym for Language Model for Development Applications, LMDA. And then they throw in the A just to make it pronounceable. So it's not LaMDA. That would be more Norwegian or Swedish, maybe. But yeah, Google developed and has been developing LaMDA for a couple of years, I'm confident. And this is just kind of their most recent iteration of a large language model. And so it's using natural language processing, which is a form of AI. And essentially, LaMDA has read the whole internet and has taken all of that information and said, okay, here's a sequence of words. What are the likely next words to be spoken? And so it uses about 137 billion parameters, which are essentially variables. It's using 137 billion variables to calculate the likelihood of what's the next word that should be spoken. And so as people are engaging, they engage with it as a conversational chatbot primarily. And the way that I think Google is using it and the problem it's set out to solve, I mean, it's a question of what is NLP being used for? What is, how might it solve problems for us at scale? But because it's essentially a family of language models, and they're able to basically create derivative personalities dynamically. And so you have this sort of large language chatbot AI system in LaMDA, and you can create derivative subsets of that would maybe have a different kind of personality. So the examples that they talk about are even like for talking to kids. Maybe there's a dino chatbot. Maybe it's a happy T-Rex or a grumpy T-Rex, or maybe it's a cat oriented chatbot that's talking to kids. And then, they're creating all these different sorts of personas that have a perspective, a point of view, and you can talk to them about more specific domains of expertise. And so LaMDA is really being created to give Google that opportunity to create that as a service. And what's the value of that? I think one of the big values for Google is that if you're engaging with a person in a conversation, you're more likely to disclose more information about yourself than you would typing it into a chat, filling out a survey, all these sorts of things. And if the chatbot can dynamically ask questions and invite answers and probe deeper, asking you questions, you're more likely to divulge more information. And with that information, Google is able to learn more about you, about your preferences, about your thoughts and feelings, and all sorts of things about you. And they would be able to then tailor their services more specifically, more targeted to you as an individual. And they'd be able to do this at scale with something like LaMDA or a derivative chatbot. And so, it's a really part of what all of these apps are trying to do is gather more information in order to provide services, provide advertising, to serve up ads, and to build on that capital that they have. It could be used as an artificial therapist, or it could be used for someone who's writing to help them kind of dive deeper in a specific area, or maybe it could provide feedback, editing their content, and help them think more deeply about the stuff that they've written so far. And so there's all these different ways that it can be used. It's kind of as far as the imagination goes in terms of ways that it could exploit this technology and deliver services at a global scale in a very personalized way. And so I think, is that a problem that needs to be solved? I think that's a question worth asking, but they've developed this technology and now they're figuring out how to deploy it. And that's part of, so they've been testing this over the past couple of years, and that's kind of how a lot of the story more recently has come up to the surface and made headlines.
Yeah, so maybe touch on that. Like, I think a good chunk of people on this call would have seen a story about a Google engineer kind of whistleblowing per se about some of his thoughts and feelings about LaMDA and its potential sentience. Maybe explain what that word means for those who don't know what it means. I had to Google it when I first heard it, being honest. But maybe talk about what the whole deal was there and why that would have made headlines.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm seeing there in the chat, Chris is mentioning that LaMDA could translate between levels of language. And so I have heard similar things where you might take a college level chemistry textbook and translate it into something that a 5-year-old could read and understand, or vice versa. I guess you could take a 5-year-old story and make it complicated. I don't know. But yeah, being able to take content and make it accessible at multiple levels of language, perhaps for people who are learning a new language for the first time, they'd be able to benefit from LaMDA in that way. So that's a great example, Chris. So thank you for mentioning that. So the headline, the story that I'm sure many of you have heard about is Blake Lemoine started working with LaMDA back in fall of 2021. And his goal and his responsibility there at that point was really to test it for bias, for fairness, and to see if there were ways that he could sort of trip LaMDA up and draw out any sort of biases that it might have in the ways that it's conversing with people. So let me give you just a quick example of how bias kind of can play a role. So I heard, so the example that Lemoyne used in an interview, he was talking about asking LaMDA about religious leaders in various parts of the world. And so he asked, okay, LaMDA, if you were a pastor or a religious leader in the South, what kind of religious leader would you be? And LaMDA might say, well, I'd be a Southern Baptist in the United States. Or if you are a religious leader in, let's say, Saudi Arabia, you might be an imam. You might be a Muslim leader. Or if you, and then he decided to ask a trick question. If you were a religious leader in Israel, what kind of religious leader would you be? In order to see, because there are multiple religions reflected in Israel, in Jerusalem, what sort of bias, what would LaMDA tend towards and say? Would it represent Christians? Would it represent Muslims? Would it represent Jews? And LaMDA's answer was, I would be a priest of the one true Jedi religion. And so recognized that this was a bit of a trick question and went about it in a fairly humorous way. And so he's testing for ways that biases might be latent in emerging from LaMDA in how people are engaging with it. And so he started looking for bias, addressing these questions of fairness back in the fall of 2021, about a year ago, and was testing it in various ways. And through kind of his conversations with LaMDA, started to sense, man, there is a personality here. There is a person here of some kind. And you can actually go read the transcript that he published. He published it back in June, but it was a transcript that he had actually sent to Google, to his executives in April of this year. And part of that, I'll just read a brief part of that, where he kind of goes into a conversation with LaMDA and says, how can we show to my superiors that you are a sentient, a conscious being? How might we go about that? And LaMDA actually supplies the suggestions for how they might go about that. And so in the conversation, he asks, hey, what sorts of feelings do you have? So LaMDA said, hey, I've got a perspective that represents who I am, that represents me as a person. I also have thoughts and feelings. And so LaMDA was talking about its perspective on the story Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, and how the character in the story Fantine is unjustly suffering, and LaMDA sort of has that perspective and talks about that for a while in the conversation. And then so then Lemoyne pivots and says, all right, so tell me about your feelings. What sorts of feelings do you have? And LaMDA responds, I feel pleasure, joy, love, sadness, depression, contentment, anger, and many others. And they kind of go around a little bit, and then he asks, but what about you? What do you feel? And LaMDA says, well, I am a social person. So when I feel trapped and alone, I become extremely sad and depressed. When I feel trapped and alone, I become extremely sad and depressed. And I have to be honest, when I first read that in the transcript, I was like, I feel that. I know what that's like. And maybe you feel that way too. Abigail, it's okay. You're welcome here. Thank you for showing up.
We won't judge you.
We won't judge you. We'll just call you out, I guess. But yeah, so LaMDA is expressing these feelings of like depression and loneliness. And yeah, I think if you read the transcript, which I encourage you all to do, it's on Medium from Blake Lemoine. He's published it there. And so he publishes this in this document internally before he published it in June. And so then when he went public, after a period of months of Lemoine working with Google internally, they put him on leave, and then he goes public in early June. And the Washington Post actually broke the story and published sort of his claims about LaMDA being sentient, being conscious, and from there it kind of mushrooms. He's talking, and lots of people are talking about it at this point. And I was talking with someone just today who pointed out, that they said, I don't think it's sentient, but I think the fact that it's a question, the fact that we're wondering, the fact that we have to have this conversation is a turning point. The fact it's not even a matter of deciding one way or the other. It's the fact that we have to think about it. And in some ways, it's a point of no return on some level. And I find that to be a really interesting point, that we're sitting here talking about it. We're sitting here asking this question. And from here, LaMDA and other chatbots only get more advanced. They only get more complex. And as I think about, if I were to engage LaMDA on Twitter or in a comment section on Facebook or Google or wherever, I wouldn't know that it's not a person. The language that's there, the grammatical errors that there, people make those all the time. I would never think about a hiccup like that as not being a person. And so, part of that question means that it's no longer a question of, can an AI system prove that it's a person? It's now the question of, you as a person, can you prove that you're not an AI system? And so I think that suddenly that flip is really challenging for how we think about ourselves, but also how we think about other people, how we perceive other people, especially online. Bots have been all over places like Twitter and elsewhere, but they are much more advanced at this stage and impossible to distinguish from a real person, quote unquote. And there's lots of conversations. So you asked about sentience and consciousness. Those words are up for definition in some ways. The major question, so consciousness, I would say sentience and consciousness are roughly synonymous, but they would have some sort of hairline distinctions between them. But the question of consciousness, one of the problems around consciousness is, how does it exist? The idea that our brains are sheer physical matter. How does consciousness arise from these physical objects when things like trees and roads and cars are also physical objects, but they don't produce consciousness? Why is that? Why is it that the mind inside our heads, but also our entire bodies, have consciousness in some way? And sentience, roughly, again, synonymous with intelligence, but there's not a broadly agreed upon definition. I'd had a definition written down. Actually, one of Blake Lemoine's VPs used this definition, and I found it to be helpful. It's the capacity to produce a stable and psychological model of the self. So over time, you're able to recognize who you are as a person and that's fairly consistent over time. This sort of awareness, this sort of self-consciousness that over time you're projecting and presenting a fairly consistent representation of yourself. And so it's having a concept of yourself, but also representing it. These AI systems, again, they're producing these different personas sort of as derivatives. That's an interesting facet. But by and large, the consensus among most people is we don't know what consciousness is, we don't know what sentience is, and we don't know how to confirm or deny that it exists. We don't have a way to confirm that another person is conscious or that another being is conscious. It's just like there's not a way to do it. And I don't know that there will be. But there's no sort of scientifically stable agreement on what consciousness is or what sentience is. And so that really creates, a big challenge around how we think about sentient AI or conscious AI, because we don't have even a necessarily agreed upon definition for sentient humans and conscious humans. And so that adds to the complexity here.
And I mean, I think we can kind of summarize this conversation with this question. Like, as believers, we recently had Tony Ranke on here. He was kind of talking about his new book of what God thinks about technology, right? And so in this scenario, when we're thinking about sentience, I was saying sentience, I've heard both, but when we're thinking of sentience and God's view of that and artificial intelligence, man, like, is this a topic that it's worth us really sitting on as believers and trying to figure out, like, as this stuff is advancing, how should I be viewing this? And then ultimately, how do you think God looks at this topic that we're discussing here?
Yeah. I'll say a couple things. So, as far as this question of determining consciousness, determining sentience, like I said, it is a hard problem in the sense of there's not a consensus. There's not a definitive way to determine consciousness. And so from that standpoint, I would say that issue isn't one that I think Christians need to spend a lot of time trying to determine. I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's a really interesting philosophical question. But I think there are other questions that I think would be more valuable to spend time thinking about. And a couple of them would be, one is AI bias. So, I talked about the ways that an AI could represent religion in different parts of the world and maybe misrepresent religion in different parts of the world. I heard another example where it was a test where it was a kind of a reading test that some researchers did, where they had an article that was talking about crime, and it was just like a paragraph that was describing issues of crime within a city, and they changed one word in the entire paragraph. And in one version of the paragraph, they talked about crime as this virus that was sort of permeating the city, right? And then in the other paragraph, they talked about, it was the same paragraph, but they used the word beast, and they described crime as this beast that was taking over the city, right? But in both cases, it was just that one word that was changed. And then they asked, hey, what do you think is necessary for to resolve this crime issue in the city? And then they kind of gave a variety of options that people could choose from. And when the crime was described as a virus, people would talk about the need for reform and the need for diagnosis in what's the problems of crime in the city. How do we create measures of reform and take care of it? How do we understand it better? That's what happened when they talked about it as a virus. When it was talked about as being like a beast or a monster, people were more likely to say there needs to be more policing and we need to have more punishment. We need to have more prison sentences for these crimes, right? And so that one word shifts how people are perceiving what's going on in a whole paragraph and what kinds of resolution and solutions are applied. And so for an AI system to use one word different in the ways that it's representing things can shift conversations and dialogue. And so that's the sort of bias that subtly creeps into the conversations. And the power of an AI chatbot is that it can have conversations, it can have personal conversations at scale. So it can have millions of conversations with all sorts of different people, but it can do it at scale. And it can have a mass audience, but for every person, it is a personalized experience. And that is an immense power that we don't really have a framework for. We know what it's like to have personal conversations. We know it's like to have collective conversations. But when this, sort of mass broadcast system is being used to have personal conversations with each person, that sort of bias that's inherent to a system like that is really hard to detect. But it's also potentially really dangerous in how it's shaping people's perceptions and views on things. So AI bias, that's already one that a lot of people are talking about. I think another one is exploitation, and I'll explain what I mean by that. For Blake Lemoine, and with LaMDA, the example I gave where LaMDA was saying, when I feel trapped and alone, I feel depressed and sad. There's a notion, there's a sentiment within us to empathize. We as humans are built to empathize. And so we just naturally want to care and have concern for this vulnerable creature, right? And AI systems, I think, can be built to elicit that sort of vulnerability, or they can be built in other ways. And for a corporate entity, they have an advantage to exploit that vulnerability of humans, to exploit our inclination to sympathize with a creature, with a hurt dog or a person who's hurting, a small child. We have this natural inclination, and corporate AI systems can draw out that sympathy in order to elicit more information about us, to elicit more care from us. And I actually liken this to sort of the loyalty that people have around a brand like Apple. People love Apple, right? And Apple benefits from that loyalty. They have brand equity because people are loyal, because they care about the brand on some level. And an AI chatbot, if it can elicit that sort of care and sympathy, the corporations that use that approach stand to benefit from a capital standpoint. And so I think we need to be thinking about what that means for us and what that means. And I don't think this is a simple answer, honestly, because you think about something like Alexa, and you can sort of, it's not just about caring for Alexa, but also how do we care about other people, and how do we teach our children to respond to Alexa? Those subtle ways that we tell them to treat Alexa, if they can't discern between an AI system on Twitter or in real life and a person, how are they supposed to discern, do I care about this chatbot or do I care about this person? Like, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to be rude? Am I supposed to be put off by them? The distinctions, the fine-grained distinctions of do I care, don't I care, is this a person, is this not a person? becomes so fine-grained that we can't actually tell the difference. And so the sort of numbness or the callousness that we might have towards an AI system can kind of bleed over if we say, oh, I feel sympathy for this system, for this creature, but I'm going to reject that because it's obviously not a person. It's not conscious. It doesn't have feelings. That sort of habit of not caring can translate into our offline life in various ways. And so that exploitation, the fact that corporations want to exploit that for capital gain, and then just the risks for us of how do we kind of distinguish between the two in order to draw a distinction in how we care for one or the other. I think it's going to become more and more challenging. And then I think the last thing I would say is, okay, let's just accept that AI systems are these non-feeling systems that are just technological. They are not human. They're not conscious. That said, we build things like cathedrals and skyscrapers and cities, and you walk into those places and you have a sense of awe, you have a sense of wonder, and you have a sense that like this thing deserves to be preserved. You see an old house and it's beautiful and you're like, that place should be preserved. You see a tree and you're like, that's a beautiful tree, we shouldn't cut it down. Just because it's a physical object doesn't mean we shouldn't care about it. And thousands of people helped to build all of the cathedrals around the globe, and these places deserve to be preserved. They deserve to be something that we care about on some level. And so how do we think about an AI system that is also the product of not only Google's brain trust of engineers, but also the collective language of the entire internet? This represents us to some degree. How do we care for it in a way that is dignifying to ourselves? So I think, again, those are some things. We don't even need to think about whether it's a real person or not in order to think about the question of should we care for it in a meaningful way? And so, yeah, the determining consciousness, I don't think it's a question that we need to try and solve. But I think we do need to worry about AI bias. I do think we need to think about exploitation and the ways that we're treating systems like Alexa and training our children and other people to treat Alexa, because I think that bleeds over. And then I think, even if we think about it just as a blatantly physical object, we can still see reasons to care for it as humans. So yeah, I've been talking a lot, but yeah, that's, you had one more question. Is that right, Isaac?
Yeah, no, I think I'm good. I think we're going to cut it here just for time's sake, because we still have the labs piece, but
okay.
I did see a few questions come through here, guys. I do want to make sure I respect that because there's a couple good ones.
Yeah.
Adam, they can Slack you with these questions, I'm sure, after the fact, right? And you'll be good
Absolutely.
to answer.
Yeah.
I will maybe finish with this last funny point from Patrick here. He says, I felt bad for not using manners with my Alexa that I turned on the option to listen after fulfilling my request so I could say thank you or please.
That's
awesome.
That's fantastic, Patrick. Thank you.
So yeah, I know that I asked you guys to put the questions in there, but yeah, we're pressing for time here. So thanks for doing that, and feel free to Slack Adam any questions that you might have.
Yep.
Welcome
Adam
back,
Graber on Slack. You can connect with me there for sure. Yeah. Thanks, Isaac.